The seeker existed in the center of a storm of perpetual noise, where the constant hum of electricity was a relentless companion and the cold blue light of screens served as the only moon. Every waking moment was occupied by the demands of a modern existence that prioritized speed over depth and frantic activity over quiet meaning. Deep within the core of their being, a spiritual stagnation had taken root, a heavy, suffocating grayness that no amount of digital entertainment or social connection could dissolve. The soul was drowning in a sea of endless distractions, gasping for the breath of something ancient, something solid, and something true. It was this internal weight that finally birthed the call, an insistent summons that resonated in the hollow spaces of the chest. It was a command felt rather than heard: leave everything behind and seek the wilderness. To stay in the city was to wither away in a comfortable cage of one's own construction. The first steps toward the desert were fueled by an electric, almost naive excitement. There was a romantic notion attached to the idea of the wasteland, a belief that the vast sands would offer an immediate cinematic clarity and a swift baptism of peace. As the concrete skyline faded into a hazy memory, replaced by the jagged, sun-bleached horizons of the dry lands, the seeker felt a momentary surge of triumph. The car was eventually left at the very edge of civilization, and with a single pack and a heavy heart, the journey into the unknown began. But as the last echoes of the mechanical world died away, replaced only by the rhythmic crunch of boots on parched earth, a new sensation emerged. It was not the peace the seeker had anticipated, but a heavy, invasive silence that seemed to press against the eardrums with the weight of deep water. The dunes rose up like silent, golden giants, indifferent to the small, fragile figure moving among them. The initial thrill of the expedition began to evaporate under a sun that did not just shine, but scrutinized with a burning intensity. This was the true nature of the wilderness, a place of radical stripping, where the environment acts as a furnace for the soul. Here, the masks we wear in the world, the professional titles, the social reputations, and the carefully curated identities begin to crack and peel away under the pressure of the heat. In the city, the seeker could hide behind 1,000 different versions of self, but the desert demands the absolute, unvarnished truth. It is a landscape that mirrors the internal emptiness of the protagonist, a vast canvas of nothingness that forces the traveler to confront the void they have spent a lifetime trying to fill with noise. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The reason the soul seeks such profound isolation when it is drowning in distraction is that the ego cannot die in a crowd. It requires the sterile, uncompromising atmosphere of the wasteland to truly fail. As the seeker pushed deeper into the shifting sands, the realization began to dawn that this was not a mere journey, but a surgical extraction of the spirit. Every step away from the comforts of the old life was a step toward a terrifying, raw vulnerability. The vast, unforgiving landscape stretched out in every direction, a sea of heat and dust that offered no sanctuary for the prideful. The silence, which had seemed so poetic from the safety of a book, now felt like a brutal interrogation. It asked the hard questions that had no easy answers, stripping away the layers of pretense until only the raw, trembling core of the spirit remained exposed to the sky. As the first day began to wane, the sun transformed from a golden tyrant into a bruised purple king, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dunes that looked like reaching fingers. The seeker found a small, sheltered hollow between two massive ridges of sand and sat down, the physical exhaustion finally catching up to the initial spiritual fervor. The air, once stiflingly hot, It turned sharp and freezing, with a speed that felt like a personal betrayal. Looking back toward the horizon where the journey had started, the seeker realized with a sudden cold jolt that all the landmarks had vanished into the twilight. The wind had already begun to smooth over the shallow footprints left in the sand, erasing any proof of where they had been. There was no path to follow back, and no light to guide the way forward. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by a silence so profound it felt like the very breath of the Creator, the seeker understood the gravity of the choice they had made. The old life was gone, and the desert had only just begun its work of dismantling the man. The realization settled in like a cold stone in the gut. There was no turning back. The first night of the soul had arrived, leaving the traveler alone with the one thing they had spent years trying to escape, the absolute truth of themselves. As the sun crested the horizon on the second day, the romanticism of the wilderness vanished, replaced by the grinding reality of biological need. Their muscles ached with a persistent throb, and their mouth felt lined with fine, abrasive grit. Thirst was no longer a minor inconvenience, it was now a primary consciousness. This parched sensation served as a symbol of an older longing, a spiritual drought that had gone unaddressed for decades. The dry heat stripped the moisture from the body, just as the relentless silence was beginning to strip the pretenses from the heart. Hunger gnawed at the fragile resolve that had driven the seeker into this wasteland. In this state of rising physical distress, the first shadow of the spiritual battle emerged as a whisper from the heat haze. The accuser's voice questioned the journey. "What are you doing here?" the voice murmured, weaving through the seeker's exhaustion. This was not a divine call. It was a fit of prideful madness. "You are not a mystic. You are a fool who has wandered into a graveyard." The accuser used comfort, painting vivid mental pictures of the life left behind, the soft cushions, the rhythmic hum of an air conditioner, and the easy chatter of a dinner party. It suggested that growth did not require such pain, and that the seeker should simply turn around before the desert claimed their sanity. The heat began to play more complex tricks on the eyes. The seeker saw fragments of their own history manifesting in the distance. A street corner from a childhood home appeared briefly atop a golden dune. The faces of those they had wronged, and those who had wronged them, seemed to flicker in the corner of their vision, demanding answers. These were the mirages of the soul, memories of past comforts and unresolved sins rising to haunt the present moment. Each phantom acted as a heavy tether, trying to pull the seeker back toward the city, the old life where deep problems could be ignored and the spirit could remain comfortably asleep. The weight of these visions was heavier than the pack on their back, demanding an emotional energy the seeker no longer possessed. The struggle became a tug-of-war between the safety of the past and the terrifying necessity of the unknown. The seeker realized that the body's cravings were merely echoes of the soul's malnutrition. In the city, they had fed on the junk food of ego, social validation, and sensory distraction. Now, deprived of those nutrients, the spiritual man was finally starving, and the pain was excruciating. This was the realization of spiritual hunger. The internal emptiness was a space that needed to be filled. Yet the habit of seeking comfort was a powerful enemy. The desire to flee back to the streets was overwhelming, a siren song of mediocrity that promised safety at the cost of the soul. By mid-afternoon, the seeker's legs finally gave way. Collapsing into the burning sand, they felt the hand of despair. Tears tracked through the dust on their cheeks. A bitter question rose up, directed toward the vast sky. Did the divine lead me out here just to perish? Is this the reward for seeking truth, to be discarded in the dust? The silence that followed was devoid of the easy answers the seeker craved. It was a moment of profound weakness, where the ego's last defenses were being crushed by the wilderness. They lay there, feeling the terrifying absence of the presence they had come to find. As the Seeker surrendered, the air changed. The oppressive heat grew static and heavy. On the horizon, the sky began to bruise with a deep, sickly violet and charcoal grey. The clouds did not drift, they boiled. A sudden, violent wind kicked up, carrying a sense of impending confrontation. The sand swirled as if the desert were preparing for war. This was the first major spiritual storm gathering, a whirlwind of suppressed emotions and shadows. The true warfare was about to begin, and the Seeker, drained and trembling, was forced to stand and face the darkness that was no longer just inside their head, but manifesting now on the horizon. The storm erupted with a roar that was less like wind and more like the collective scream of every secret the Seeker had ever tried to bury. The sky, once a vast expanse of blue and later a bruised violet, now turned a suffocating ink black. This was no ordinary sandstorm. As the grit lashed against the Seeker's skin, each grain seemed to carry a weight of memory, a sharp sting of a past transgression. The wind spoke in the voices of the abandoned and the betrayed. It was a whirlwind of suppressed emotions. A chaotic vortex where every trauma the Seeker had masked with the noise of the city now came rushing back with predatory intent. There was no room to hide and no crowded street to vanish into. The wilderness had become a mirror, reflecting not the physical form, but the jagged, unhealed landscape of the inner man. Standing in the center of the gale, the Seeker clutched their chest, feeling the suffocating pressure of every regret they had ever pushed aside. The mirror of the wilderness was relentless. It showed the Seeker the faces of parents they hadn't called in years, friends they had used as stepping stones, and the version of themselves they had carefully curated for the world, while the true self withered in the dark. Every distraction was gone, and in the absence of noise, the truth was deafening. The motivation to find truth became more desperate as the ego began to fragment under the pressure. The Seeker realized that the man who had entered the desert could not be the one who left it. It was within this maelstrom that the adversary made himself known with chilling clarity. This was no longer just a vague sense of doubt. It was a targeted assault on the Seeker's identity. The adversary wove specific lies into the Seeker's mind, whispers feeling like their own thoughts. "You are a hollow vessel," the voice hissed over the wind. "You came here seeking God because you were too cowardly to face your own failures in the light of the world. You are unlovable, and this isolation is merely your natural state." The adversary used deep insecurities as weapons, claiming the divine had led them here for disposal. These were the lies that had kept the Seeker in spiritual bondage for years, the invisible chains of failure, shame, and regret that had dictated every move in the city. As the physical and spiritual battery continued, the Seeker's outward frustration began to dissolve into something much heavier and more profound: inward sorrow. The anger at the heat, the thirst, and the silence died away, replaced by a gut-wrenching realization of their own brokenness. This was the beginning of true repentance, a recognition of the distance between their soul and the Creator. The tears that fell were no longer for their own discomfort, but for the years wasted in the service of an ego that was now blowing away like dust in the wind. The purification process was a searing heat, yet the Seeker began to understand the purpose of the flames. Like gold being refined, the intensity of the storm was intended to burn away the dross of bitterness and pretense, leaving behind only that which was eternal and true. Just as the Seeker's strength reached its absolute limit, the wind began to falter. The roaring subsided into a low, mournful whistle, and the dust settled back into the dunes. The Seeker lay face down in the sand, trembling and hollowed out, but strangely lighter. In the eerie stillness that followed the storm, a faint, rhythmic sound reached their ears, a gentle, rhythmic dripping. dragging their battered body toward the base of a jagged rock formation uncovered by the shifting sands, the seeker found it, a hidden spring. It was not a gushing river, but a tiny silver thread of water seeping from the stone into a small, natural basin. It was barely enough to fill a single cup, but it was cold and life-giving. Drinking the few drops, they understood the revelation of the daily bread. The divine would not provide a lifetime supply of certainty. Instead, there was just enough grace for this difficult moment, teaching that survival lay in an absolute moment-by-moment dependence on the source of all. The night descended with a coldness that seeped into the seeker's marrow, turning sweat into a freezing layer of frost. Every grain of sand felt like a needle, and the silence was so loud it hummed in the ears like a distant, angry swarm. The stars were distant, cold witnesses to a solitude that felt absolute. This was the midnight cry, the peak of isolation, where the seeker felt abandoned by both man and God. In the city, a light was always on to fend off the void. But here, the void was a physical weight pressing against the chest. The seeker sat by the dripping spring, realizing this small miracle only prolonged the agony of a trial that felt increasingly purposeless. There was a theological necessity to this abandonment. The soul had to be truly lost, stripped of every anchor, before it could be found. This was the dark night of the soul, a cavernous hollow where the ego's screams finally stopped, leaving a silence that swallowed time. The seeker felt the weight of being the only living thing for miles, a tiny speck of consciousness in a vast, indifferent universe that seemed to have forgotten their name. Inside, a civil war raged. The old nature, a creature of habit and comfort, fought to survive against the emerging spiritual man. The memories of luxury were no longer comforts, but ghosts that haunted every waking thought. The old self pointed to the cracked lips and shivering limbs as proof of a failed experiment. It mocked the spiritual call, labeling it a delusion born of a weak mind. This old self mourned the city's predictable rhythms and the warmth of mediocrity. Opposite this was the emerging spiritual man, a fragile entity that understood the silence was a presence. But as the darkness stretched on, the battle became exhausting. A heavy apathy settled over the seeker like a shroud. The danger of giving up was a seductive urge to just lie down and let the desert swallow their purpose, to become another nameless part of the landscape. Every muscle ached with the desire to surrender, to let the cold take over and end the relentless pursuit of an invisible truth. As the moon reached its zenith, the dunes transformed into the arched cathedrals of a natural sanctuary. The silver light turned the waste into a place of stark, terrifying beauty. The silence was pregnant with a weight that demanded attention. As if the desert were holding its breath, it was in this light that the tension reached its breaking point. From the shadows, a figure emerged with a silent, fluid grace. As it drew closer, the seeker's heart hammered. The moonlight revealed every line of its perfect, deceptive face. The figure was not a stranger, but a mirror image. This was the shadow, a refined reflection of the seeker. It wore the luxurious clothes of the city, looking healthy and untouched by the grit or the sun, a vision of the success the seeker had once craved. The shadow spoke in a perfected version of the seeker's own voice. "Why suffer for a whisper you can no longer hear?" it asked, its eyes reflecting the starlight with a predatory glint. The shadow's smile was as cold as the starlight, a sharp contrast to the genuine warmth the seeker had once imagined finding in the wild. The shadow gestured toward the horizon's faint glow. "I know the way back. I found a shortcut that avoids the fire and the stripping you so clearly fear. We can be back in the city by dawn, restored to your life as a hero who conquered the waste. No one has to know you broke or that you ever doubted yourself. You can have the wisdom without the scars, the crown without the cross, and the world will believe you." The suspense hung heavy in the air. The shadow was offering the ultimate shortcut, a way to bypass the death of the ego and the pain of rebirth. The cost was hidden, but absolute. To take the shadow's hand was to reclaim the old nature and forfeit the soul's transformation. The seeker stared at the outstretched hand, the promise of comfort clashing with the agonizing necessity of the harsh wilderness. The spiritual man felt the weight of the decision on the edge of eternity, caught between a comfortable lie and a painful truth that required everything. The seeker stared at the shadow's outstretched hand, a hand that promised an end to the agonizing thirst and the crushing weight of the solitude. For a heartbeat, the temptation was nearly physical, a magnetic pull toward the familiar comforts of the old life. The shadow's face, a perfect reflection of the seeker's own features, radiated false compassion. It offered the crown without the cross, the wisdom of the desert without the scars of the journey. But as the seeker looked deeper into those familiar eyes, they saw the hollow void behind the gaze. There was no life there, only the echo of a man who had spent his years running from the truth. The seeker realized that to take this shortcut was to step back into a prison of their own making, a life of masks and mirrors where the soul would continue to starve in the midst of plenty. With a voice that was little more than a rasping whisper, yet carried the weight of an iron decree, the seeker spoke. No. That single word shattered the illusion. The shadow's face contorted in a silent, jagged scream of frustration before its form began to dissolve like smoke in a gale. The luxuries bled into the dark, leaving the seeker standing alone in the silver light of the moon. The climax of the spiritual warfare was not won with a sword, but with the simple, agonizing choice to remain in the fire. As the last remnants of the shadow vanished, the seeker felt their own ego finally shatter. It was the breaking point they had feared since the first day, yet in the moment of its arrival, it felt like a liberation. Every defense mechanism, every bit of intellectual pride, and every remaining shred of self-reliance crumbled into the sand. The seeker collapsed, not in defeat, but in total, unreserved surrender to the divine. "Do with me what you will," they breathed, the last of their personal ambition exhaling into the desert night. In that absolute void of the self, the supernatural encounter began. It was not a vision seen with the eyes, but an experience that consumed every sense. The cold air of the midnight dunes was suddenly permeated by a warmth that was not physical. It was the fire of purification, a spiritual heat that began to move through the seeker's soul like molten gold. This was the furnace they had been led toward since the journey began. The fire did not burn the flesh, but it seared the spirit, seeking out the deep-seated roots of bitterness, the hidden pockets of vanity, and the ancient grudges that had long poisoned the seeker's heart. They watched in a state of holy awe as the flames consumed the dross of their character. The pride that had demanded a spectacular sign, the arrogance that had judged others for their noise, and the fear that had kept them from true vulnerability, all of it was being reduced to ash. As the fire moved through them, the seeker's perception of the wilderness underwent a radical transformation. The redemption of the moment lay in the realization that the warfare had never been against the desert's harshness. The thirst, the heat, and the silence were never the enemies. They were the tools of a master craftsman. The true battle had been against the internal resistance to grace, the stubborn I that fought to stay on the throne of the heart. With this realization came a profound peace that surpassed all understanding. The desert, which moments ago had seemed like a cruel graveyard, now appeared as a majestic cathedral of sovereignty. The seeker saw the beauty in the barrenness, the divine order in the shifting sands, and the mercy in the stripping away of everything non-essential. The intense heat of the purification subsided, leaving the seeker lighter, as if 1,000 unnecessary weights had been lifted. The silence that followed was not the empty, terrifying silence of the earlier nights. It was a pregnant stillness, a quiet that was full of a presence. And then, from the heart of that silence came the voice. It was not a roar like the storm or a thunderous command from the heavens. It was the still, small voice of the divine, speaking directly into the hollowed-out center of the seeker's being. It was a sound of pure truth. It didn't provide a map back to the city or a list of instructions. Instead, it spoke words of identity and belonging, confirming that the seeker was known, seen, and loved in the middle of the waste. The dawn that followed the night of fire was unlike any other morning the seeker had ever known. As the first pale light stretched across the dunes, there was no longer a sense of dread or the frantic need for escape. Instead, a profound clarity settled over the landscape, a sharpness of vision that went beyond the physical realm. His body was lean, marked by the sun and the wind, yet he felt a strength pulsing through his veins that was not born of calories or hydration. It was a spiritual vitality, a residue of the encounter with the divine that had restructured the very molecules of his being. The warfare was over, and in the stillness of the aftermath, the seeker found himself standing in the center of a victory he had not won by his own hand, but by the simple act of letting go. The desert was the same, yet it was entirely different. To his eyes, the wilderness had begun to bloom. This was not a literal change in the flora of the dunes, but a metaphorical transformation of his perception. Where he once saw only barren waste and the threat of death, he now saw a landscape teeming with the presence of the Creator. Every grain of sand seemed to vibrate with a sacred purpose. The heart of the seeker, once a parched and cracked earth of spiritual stagnation, had become a garden in the middle of the waste. The seeds of truth that had been buried under layers of ego and noise were finally pushing through the soil of his soul. He realized that the harshness of the environment was the very thing that had provided the pressure necessary for life to emerge. The furnace had not consumed him. It had merely cleared the ground for something eternal to grow. In this sanctuary of sand, the seeker sat and meditated on the lessons etched into his spirit. He understood now that silence was not an empty void, but a reservoir of wisdom. He realized that the trials he had endured, the thirst, the heat, and the whispering lies of the accuser, were not punishments designed to destroy him, but invitations to depend entirely on the divine. The spiritual warfare had stripped away his self-sufficiency, leaving him with the most powerful weapon of all, total dependence. He saw clearly that the noise of the city had been a drug, a way to numb the soul against the reality of its own need. Here, in the raw honesty of the wilderness, he had learned that the only true strength was found in the surrender of his own will to the sovereign hand that guided the stars. This realization brought with it a profound emotional resolution. As the seeker looked toward the horizon, the faces of those who had hurt him in the old life began to drift through his mind. In the past, these memories would have triggered a surge of bitterness or the familiar sting of resentment. But now, in the light of the new day, those wounds felt distant, cleaned by the desert wind. He found a deep, inexplicable forgiveness for the people of the city, and perhaps more importantly, for his own past failures. The shame that the accuser had used as a chain was broken. He saw his mistakes not as defining stains, but as the very dross that the fire had been sent to remove. He was no longer the man who had entered the desert. He was a stranger to his own former self. The concept of the new man was no longer an idea, but a lived reality. He felt clothed in a new kind of humility. This humility was a quiet assurance that he belonged to the divine. He was armed with wisdom that recognized the shadows' shortcuts for the traps they truly were. He knew this peace was not a fragile emotion, but a foundation built on desert rock. However, the wilderness was a school, not a home. The path back was revealing itself, appearing as a deliberate way forward. He was carrying a treasure the city could never provide, an internal wellspring of peace. He began to walk, now forever changed by the sacred landscape that had saved his soul. The horizon no longer shimmered with the illusions of a desperate mind. As the seeker crested the final ridge of the shifting dunes, the landscape began a profound transition. The treacherous sand gave way to patches of scrub brush and eventually to the hard, unyielding earth of the desert's edge. In the distance, the jagged silhouette of the city rose against the sky like a crown of glass and steel, its lights beginning to flicker as the sun dipped below the world's rim. The seeker's pace remained measured and rhythmic. He was no longer running away from the silence, nor was he running toward the noise. He walked with the steady gait of a man who had already found what he was looking for in the heart of the emptiness. The first paved road felt alien beneath his boots, a cold and artificial surface that lacked the ancient wisdom of the dunes. As the distant hum of traffic reached his ears, he realized that he was entering a different kind of wilderness. This was the wilderness of the modern world, a vast expanse of distraction and spiritual stagnation that was far more dangerous than the physical desert he had just conquered. He looked at the glowing skyline and saw not a sanctuary, but a battlefield where millions of souls wandered in a daze, their internal voices drowned out by the machine's relentless roar. He understood now that the spiritual warfare he had endured was not a localized event, but a universal reality. The accuser did not live in the dunes. It lived in the mirrors, the screens, and the quiet moments of self-doubt that people spent their entire lives trying to avoid. His journey had been a necessary stripping, preparing him for the life he was about to resume. He was returning to the city, but he was not returning to his old self. The new man was a vessel that had been forged in the furnace and cooled in the stillness of the divine presence. He carried within him a treasure that the city's commerce could never purchase, an unshakable peace and a clarity of purpose that transcended the chaos of modern existence. To those who feel the weight of their own spiritual malnutrition, the seeker's message is clear. The wilderness is unavoidable for those who truly seek the truth. We are all called, at some point, to leave the safety of our distractions and face the raw honesty of our own souls. The spiritual warfare we fear is the very thing that liberates us from the masks of the ego and the lies of the adversary. Do not flee from the seasons of purification when they arrive. It is the fire of the divine, seeking out the dross and the bitterness to make room for a garden that can bloom in the middle of the waste. Standing at the threshold where the golden sand finally met the grey asphalt, the seeker paused and turned his head. He looked back at the vast expanse of the wilderness, the place that had once terrified him and threatened to swallow his soul. A deep, unexpected wave of gratitude washed over him. He bowed his head toward the dunes, acknowledging the sacred ground where his pride had died and his spirit had been reborn. The desert had not been a graveyard. It had been a womb. It was the place where he had learned that true strength is found in dependence on the divine, whose voice is louder than any storm. The final lesson of the journey was etched forever into his heart. The desert is not where you go to die, but where you go to truly begin living. As he turned his back on the sand and stepped into the lights of the city, he knew the battle would continue. But he was no longer afraid. The warfare had changed him, and in that transformation, he had found his true home. The seeker walked forward, a silent witness to the power of the wilderness, leaving a lingering question for every soul still lost in noise. What is your wilderness calling you to surrender? The path to the new man begins with the first step into the silence.